Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week, Cadaver, I Hardly Knew Her, boom, I'm discussing The Last Man on Earth, created by Will Forte. And this show, actually, I just learned this, that it was originally intended to be a feature film, and the idea originated with the writing team of Phil Lord and Christopher Miller. And then when they brought the idea to Will Forte, he just took the premise and kind of ran with it, and he wound up developing the idea into a TV series. And so the show premiered on Fox back in March 2015. And this is actually one of the very few shows I had watched since the beginning, since its premiere. I remember the first 2 episodes were available on Hulu, so I watched them and just instantly was taken by the show, was drawn in by the premise. And I have to say, that the pilot episode, Alive in Tucson, it's so strongly written. It captures the premise for the series, the concept so well. It really draws you in, sets up the series perfectly, in my opinion. Because oftentimes with other shows, they can be really heavy with exposition because you have to set up the world, you have to introduce the characters, and so they tend to be on the weaker side for the overall writing of the series. But with this show, the first episode is one of the strongest written episodes of the whole show, and it just sets up the show so well. It's really compelling. It just draws you in, makes you interested, makes you want to watch more. And so let's get into it. That first episode, as I said, it's called Alive in Tucson. And we meet the main character, Phil Miller, played by Will Forte, who is presumably the last man on Earth. And he's traveling around the country. He keeps drawing X's over places on a map after he searches the world and doesn't find anyone. And as he's searching, he's spray painting on billboards, Alive in Tucson, in hopes that someone out there will find him. And so we learn that it's set in the future, in the year 2019. And actually, no, sorry. It's set in 2021. And that the virus happened in 2019. So it's been 2 years since the virus hit. And so after his search, Phil just goes back to Tucson and he moves into a mansion. And he starts filling the house with all of these amazing items he's collected along the way in his travels. He's got the presidential rug. He's got original paintings that he stole from museums, from famous painters like Van Gogh and Monet. He's got Dorothy's ruby slippers. He's got Babe Ruth's bat. And so it becomes this interesting thing where if you have all the time in the world to yourself to do anything you want, it seems like this great thing at first where rules don't apply, you could just do anything at all. But of course, the loneliness slowly but surely catches up to Phil. Because at first there's just all these antics of him playing bocce ball or him bowling in parking lots, and then he gets bored with that and just escalates into him using cars to smash into each other. Just ridiculous things. He buys expensive wine that's $10,000 and he takes a sip and he says, that was like a $400 sip. But then he starts to become increasingly depressed. And there's one point where he's using a power generator to watch the movie Castaway, starring Tom Hanks. And in that movie, Tom Hanks is on an island by himself. He ends up talking to a volleyball, Wilson. And then Phil kind of mocks it, saying, that's ridiculous, that's never going to happen to me, balls are for fun. But then, of course, so it flash forwards 5 months later, and the house is absolutely trashed. And Phil just keeps getting drunk. And one part that just made me laugh out loud, he wipes his mouth using the Declaration of Independence. But he ends up, of course, he just has this whole collection of various sports balls that he's adopted as his friends. He's got a volleyball, he's got a soccer ball, a golf ball, tennis ball, football. He's given them all these names. His favorite one seems to be one named Gary, a volleyball. And he talks to them about how he misses women and how he'd give anything to see a woman again. And then he ends up kind of just falling for a random mannequin. And there's one point where he goes to talk to the mannequin after Gary encourages him to. And so he talks to this mannequin, he says how pretty she is, he kisses it, and then he says he apologizes for being too forward. He goes to shake the mannequin's hand and introduce himself, and then the arm falls off. And then he just kind of realizes that he's losing it. He's tired of being alone. And so then he's on the beach, and we see Phil Miller, and he writes June 1980 to November 2021, November-ish 2021. So he's going to kill himself. And so it's a heavy moment. He says he apologizes for giving up, and then there's a moment where he says, "Oh, and huge apology to Tom Hanks and the whole crew that put together Castaway, because they nailed it. They friggin' nailed it." And so he gets in his car and he's driving at full speed, planning to crash. He has a bullseye on a huge boulder, but then all of a sudden he looks and he brakes hard and he sees smoke in the distance. So it's a sign of someone else out there. And then he goes there and he sees a bra hanging, so he knows it's a woman, and he just kind of collapses in emotions. And he's like sniffing the bra, he's kind of getting kind of weird, and then he just passes out. And so then he wakes up and he is envisioning this attractive woman, and then when he comes to, the woman turns out to be Carol Pilbagian, played by Kristen Schaal. And the two of them don't exactly hit it off. She's terrified. She actually pulls out a gun on him because he's just like some weirdo guy sniffing her bra. And so their first interaction is basically Phil, because he's scared, and he says, "There's nothing to be afraid of." And then Carol says, "Nothing of which to be afraid." And Phil says, "But I just said that." And Carol says, "You can't end sentences with prepositions. Nothing of which to be afraid is the proper grammar." And so he assures her that he's a nice person, and she explains that he wet his underpants, and he looks down and he says, "Oh, I didn't wet my underpants. They were already like that." And so right off the bat, he lies to her because he's embarrassed that he wet himself because he was scared. And so then they start over and they get to know one another and they introduce themselves. He says, "I'm Phil Miller, last man on Earth," and she says, "I'm Carol Pilbagian, last woman on Earth." And they don't exactly hit it off. Even when Phil is convincing her to put down the gun, he says, "What do you need that gun out for?" And Carol, again, still with the grammar police, she says, "Don't you mean out for what do you need that gun?" And Phil just says, "Okay, that can't be right." And so, of course, he has to deal with the irony that he wanted to see a woman again, but this isn't the type of woman he necessarily had envisioned in his mind. So the two of them, we quickly learn, have opposing attitudes when it comes to dealing with this post-virus life of having no other humans on Earth, supposedly. Because Phil likes the idea that they can just do whatever they want, where he's driving and Carol asks him to stop at the stop sign, and she doesn't like when he goes to park in a handicapped spot and then he just drives through the store, because he explains that this is one of the benefits of their situation, that nothing matters, that anything could be a parking spot. But with her, she misses being a human being. She wants to still be attached to rules and laws. And so then when she later finally addresses the elephant in the room for them, that they need to repopulate the Earth, he says that he doesn't want to have sex with her if she were the last person on Earth, and she says, well, vice versa, but this is what they have to do. And so then he figures, okay, we'll do it. But then she tells him that they can't have sex unless they're married. And so he just he gets super annoyed by that. There's a funny gag also earlier in the episode where she's showing off her garden and she bites into a tomato and she's saying like, oh, what a great tomato. And he says, it's tomato. And she says, some people say tomato. I'm one of those people. And so then she wants to get married for them to have sex. And then Phil just at one point stands up, he walks away, and he says, what is happening? It's tomato! It's tomato! But then he comes back and he says, okay, so I'll propose to you, even though he's reluctant about the whole thing. And so in the following episode, titled Raisin Balls and Wedding Bells, Carol plans out this whole beautiful wedding for the two of them, and all she asks is that Phil gets the rings. So of course, the one thing she asks, he doesn't do it, sadly, even though she went through all this trouble. And even when she asks him flat out, did you get the rings, be honest? And he says, you think I would start this marriage out with a lie? But then, of course, he did lie. And so that's when he really first starts to actually try with her. And he really feels bad because he sees then that she went through all this effort. He later goes back to her house and he sees that she decorated the whole house and she made a cake out of God knows what. At one point he just says, is that eggplant? Because, no perishable foods in this world. But then he decides that he wants to try for her, and he thinks, well, it's better to have her than to be alone again. And so then they go through with the wedding, and there's a funny moment in that episode where earlier in the episode she says, one of us should probably be the president. And he says, fine, Carol, you could be the president of the United States. And she says, oh no, I'm terrified of public speaking. And he says, fine, I'll be the president. And she says, oh, we have to put it to a vote. And he says, okay. So he votes for himself, she votes for him. And she says, oh, it was unanimous. I don't think that ever happened before. So then after they get married and after they have sex for the first time, she just says, I can't believe I had sex with the president of the United States. Carol's just a great character because she's got her quirks, but she's very sweet. And so then, of course, the irony at the end of the episode, when Phil's getting used to the idea of being married to Carol, he collides with a limo, and it turns out to be another woman. And this woman is Melissa Shart, played by January Jones. And so then, I just have to say, with this whole season, Phil as a whole is an unlikable character because he lies a lot, and the whole thing with him is that he's trying to sleep with other people. He wants to sleep with Melissa, and then that doesn't pan out because then another guy ends up showing up, Todd Rodriguez, played by Mel Rodriguez, coincidentally, same last name. So right then and there, once Todd shows up, Phil's no longer the last man on Earth, but it is what it is. So then a couple other women show up later in the season. We meet Erica Dundee, played by Cleopatra Coleman, and then Gail Klosterman, played by Mary Steenburgen. And then the last person to join the group is coincidentally another man named Phil Miller. What are the odds? So few people in the world, and two men, both named Phil Miller. He's played by Boris Kodjoe. And this new Phil Miller, he's this ideal guy, super attractive, muscular, very hands-on with getting supplies and resources and everything they need to maintain their survival in this post-virus world that they're living in. And then Melissa and Todd end up becoming a couple, but then when this new Phil comes along, Melissa develops feelings for him as well as Carol. And until that point, Phil, the old Phil, was always trying to sleep with the other women that kept coming into the group. So then what happens is Phil and Carol end up getting a divorce toward the end of season 1. And then Carol just sleeps with the new Phil, but she just wants to have sex for fun, not necessarily to repopulate the earth. And then in the season 1 finale, Phil, the old Phil, they end up I keep saying old Phil and new Phil. The way they get around that to get rid of the confusion is they ask them what are their middle names so they can avoid the confusion. And the new Phil says he doesn't have a middle name. And Phil, our original Phil, reluctantly says that his middle name is Tandy. So from that point on, they call him Tandy. Which, that's a cool name anyway. Tandy, it's unique. So then, as I was saying, in the season 1 finale, Tandy basically gets banished from the group. And Phil drives him out to the desert, where he basically leaves him for dead. And Phil basically is the new leader of the group. So Tandy's all alone, but then it turns out that Carol comes back for him, and she decides she wants to stay with him, and they end up reconnecting because she wants to be with someone who, if they had left someone in the desert and didn't have the heart to go through with it, because Tandy earlier in the season wanted to get rid of Todd by leaving him in the desert, but he decided not to go through with it. And so Tandy says, well, I think you're making a big mistake, but she wants to go with him anyway. And so they reunite. And then at the very end, he tells her, she says, let's start all over. And he tells her that he had a brother. And she says, oh, I never knew that before. And so then it pans up all the way to outer space. And we see his brother alone on a spaceship trying to make contact with Earth but getting no response. And he's played by Jason Sudeikis. And so in the season 2 premiere titled Is There Anybody Out There?, Tandy and Carol are living on their own, just traveling the US together. And there's a funny gag where Tandy's just driving a military jet, because that's, again, one of the unique things about their post-virus world. You can just get any vehicle you want, any vehicle in the world. And so Carol takes out a gun, shoots the glass to walk into the store. She comes out with tequila. And so now Tandy's not alone when he had his margarita pool in season 1 drinking by himself. Now he and Carol are together. And so Carol, with her drawings in that episode, we learned that the two of them got remarried. But there's also a drawing of the group in Tucson. She misses them. And so at the end of that episode, Tandy and Carol end up accidentally getting separated. Tandy ends up accidentally leaving her at a gas station. And so they're separated until the following episode, titled The Boo, when they reunite by... Well, actually, there's a funny gag when, as Tandy's driving away, Carol's trying to get his attention, and so she shoots her gun in the air. And it matches up with the gunshots in the song Paper Planes by MIA. But they end up reuniting when he has a train. He writes a message on it, so he sends a train out so she's able to read the message and go back to him in Tucson. And in Tucson, he finds a note saying that the gang has moved to Malibu. And it's a note specifically for Carol saying if she wants to come find them, that's where they are, but to not bring Tandy because it's not safe. And so at first he keeps this from her, but then he finally tells her, and she's happy that he's finally being honest with her. So this is the start of him becoming a more likable character. Really in the season 1 finale too, when he redeems himself because he sings her a song, and he's showing that he's genuine, that he does care for her, and he loves her now, and she loves him as well. And so in season 2, in the following episode, Dead Man Walking, this is the start of a hilarious running gag in this series where, so they find the gang in Malibu, and they see a new guy sitting with them, and it's none other than Will Ferrell playing the character Gordon. And so the gag is that any celebrity cameo on this show, they're killed within seconds of being on screen. And so he ends up dying because Carol walks up to them and surprises them. She just says, boo, and he gets scared and he has a heart attack, the poor man. I actually didn't mention this yet, the music. The series composer is Mark Mothersbaugh, who's worked on many shows, but most notably to me, he was one of the series composers on Rugrats, and he also composed the Rugrats theme song, so that's awesome. But back to this show. So in the season 2 episode Secret Santa, that's a fun episode. Well, it starts out as a fun episode because Carol decks out the entire house with Christmas decorations, and the gang does Secret Santa. And so they give each other extravagant gifts because obviously money has no value in this world for them. They can just get anything they want. It doesn't matter. Erica gets Carol a chair that's from the Oprah audience, and then she tells her to look under her chair, and then it's none other than J-Lo's green dress, her iconic green dress that she wore on the red carpet for the Grammys or something like that. And then Tandy pulled his own name because he traded with Phil. He wants to get on Phil's good side. And so he gave Phil Erica's name. I didn't mention this either, that Phil ended up impregnating Erica. So Phil wants to make amends with Erica. And so Tandy gets himself a yacht, and Melissa gets Todd's name. She gives him a sash and gives him the opportunity to be a prom king like he always wanted. And it's a sweet moment between them, even though they had broken up earlier in the series, because relationships shift around a lot in this show within this little group. Because at that point in the series, that's when Todd was secretly sleeping with Gail, because Gail had lost Gordon, and so she was upset about that, even though Melissa wanted to get back together with Todd. I realize I'm kind of jumping around with all the details and everything. I'm just trying to piece things together. But anyway, so continuing with the episode, Carol gives Melissa these expensive boots that she wanted, but then she bedazzled them because that's just the way Carol is. She likes to go all out. She loves all her crafts and being really over the top with that. And so then Phil brings Erica to this room that he made, and it's for her to be able to look at her baby, a sonogram with the medical chair and everything set up. And so then toward the end of that episode, Melissa wants to mend things with Todd, and she proposes to him, and he kind of doesn't know what to say, and then all of a sudden Phil collapses to the ground. And so in the following episode, we're kept in suspense, because this is the first episode in the series that doesn't feature the group. It's called Pitch Black, this episode. And in this one, Phil's brother, Mike Miller, ends up deploying from his spacecraft to come back down to Earth. And he takes with him his little worm. So as he was up there, he was very alone, and he just had these worms that, one by one, they unfortunately died. And so his last two were Nancy and Terry. And then first Nancy passed, and he put that one up. There were other names of other worms that had passed, and then Terry. And so with that last worm gone, he was ready to kill himself, but then he saw that there was another worm still alive, and he named that one Phil. And so then he finally has this newfound determination to finally try to get back to Earth after he's been in space for 3 years. And he knows that there's no life on Earth. And so he crashes into a boat, and he uses this paddle boat to find another boat where he meets a man named Pat Brown, who introduces himself as the last man on Earth. And Pat Brown is this paranoid guy and kind of unsettling and not trusting at all. He thinks the government is after him. And so he tries to bond with Mike. And as Mike is getting to know Pat and everything, as they're driving around, he sees the Alive in Tucson. He sees one of the billboards with Alive in Tucson, and he wants to go there because he says, oh, that's where I'm from. Maybe my family's there, but, it's false hope. And so Pat decides he can't trust Mike anymore, and he knocks him out and basically leaves him with thousands and thousands of dead bodies. But Mike wakes up and he manages to escape. And so in the following episode, unfortunately, Phil, he suffered from a ruptured appendix, and Gail tries to save him even though she keeps telling them that she's not a doctor, she was a chef, but they have no option. They're trusting Gail to try to save him, to cut out his appendix, but sadly he doesn't make it. And then they have a funeral for him, and when Tandy is going through his stuff, he looks at his driver's license and he sees Philip Stacy Miller. So it was such a great payoff that we thought Phil didn't have a middle name, but it turns out his middle name was even worse. His middle name was Stacy. And so in the following episode, Mike ends up reuniting with Tandy, with his long-lost brother who he thought he was gone forever. And he found them because he found the note saying that they were in Malibu. And so even with them reunited, though, you see the sibling rivalry between them because Tandy is jealous that his younger brother is so well liked by everyone in the group, but Carol tells him that he should be happy because he's the only one in the entire world who has actual family, because he's back with his brother again. And so in the following episode, Tandy learns that he says to Carol that he's sterile, and so they want Mike to impregnate Carol. And in that episode, Falling Slowly, in one of the most hilarious and awkward scenes of the entire show, so Mike agrees to have sex with Carol to get her pregnant. And so first they do a makeshift wedding where Tandy and Carol get a divorce, and then first it was going to be Carol and Todd getting married, but then Mike steps in because Tandy decides he wants his brother to do it. And so then Tandy's feeling threatened because he thinks that Carol's going to fall for his little brother Mike, and he gives them these unitards that just have a hole cut out for their private areas, and he says, oh, and I'll be in the room with you guys. And so then the sex scenes on this show are just so awkward and hilarious, but because Carol just says like all these bizarre things that I guess turn her on. So in this scenario, she's just talking about a picnic and saying, oh, the ants are climbing up, they're going to the coleslaw, did you bring the fried chicken, all these weird funny things. But then Tandy is just sitting there watching them as he's watching them, and they're sort of getting into it, and it's just so bizarre and weird, and then he just screams, Carol, I love you, at the most inopportune moment to tell his wife finally that he loves her, and then she's just so overwhelmed. She says, I love you too, Tandy, and Mike's just like, okay, this is too weird, and then Tandy just says, oh, and I love you too, to Mike, and Mike's like, I don't really care. It's so ridiculous. But then it turns out, so then the following morning, Carol learns that she's pregnant, and as it turns out, Tandy wasn't impotent. He got her pregnant. And then sadly in the season 2 finale called 30 Years of Science Down the Tubes, it appears that Mike seems to have contracted the virus because he's coughing up blood, and then they say he's got to go because they don't want to catch it, obviously. And by the way, with this show, it's never actually explained why these people haven't contracted the virus. In other words, what it is about them that makes them supposedly immune to this virus. It's never explained. But in the season finale, Mike is basically presumed to have contracted the virus, and so he goes back to Tucson, and Tandy goes with him, but Mike wants him to go back to the group. He says it's his dying wish. So Tandy gives him his collection of sports balls, saying, these pals got me through hard times, maybe they'll help you. And so then at the end of that episode, we see Pat with 2 other people coming to attack the group. And so in the season 3 premiere, titled General Breast Theme with Cobras. Pat is basically going to kill the group, or so it seems, because they all have guns and everyone's terrified. And then Melissa just takes out a gun and shoots one of the men, and he goes down. He takes off his mask, and it's Jon Hamm. And that's an extra funny joke because January Jones played Jon Hamm's ex-wife in the show Mad Men. Jon Hamm plays Don Draper. So that's just a funny cameo. So they're left with these two men. They're left with Pat and a man named Lewis, who's played by Kenneth Choi. And so they don't get good vibes from Pat because he's this kind of creep, and even Lewis himself confesses to them that Pat is dangerous. But Pat gives them jeans, and he gives a pair to Tandy, saying, "Oh, it's just your general breast theme with cobras, just these jeans that he paints on." And they basically want to get rid of Pat, and Pat senses the threat, and he wants to kill all of them. So then there's a point where he just takes out his gun again, ready to kill all of them, and that's when they go running. They have the original A-Team van. They're driving away, and Todd runs over Pat, so they think he died. And then we later find out Tandy goes to move the body, and then when he goes back, he sees that it's gone, and that Pat is gone. So Pat's still out there. And then with Lewis, sadly, he doesn't stay with the group for too long. He's in a few episodes, but then he was practicing flying. He wanted to fly to try to find his partner, even though his partner, he knows deep down, most likely has died from the virus. But then he goes to fly for the first time, and he just crashes. And you just see his plane go up in flames, and poor Lewis dies. And so with each death, they have a funeral, and Gail plays her accordion, and Todd sings some obscure song. And with this one, Erica is just super despondent, and she says, "So basically I'm cursed," because she talks about how she had hope with each one of these people in her life, but Phil, the father of her child, has passed, and Lewis, who said he would take her to Australia, has passed. And through all this, in this season, Melissa, after she shoots that man, she basically goes into a state of PTSD, and she is kind of not mentally stable throughout most of the season. And so they keep her in kind of a holding cell just for her own safety. A few episodes later, it's a flash forward. It's flash forward 6 months. And I haven't mentioned this character yet. Before that, they end up meeting another character who's been on his own, and it's a child for the first time. And it's a kid who just doesn't speak at all, and they end up, Tandy just calls him Jasper. We never learn his real name. But Jasper, honestly, he's pretty much a pointless character. He doesn't add that much to the show. Basically, adults try to use him for their own agenda with certain things as certain plots come up in the series, but he's just not that interesting of a character. No offense to him. That's just how I feel. One of the really only interesting things about him is that he wears just random superhero costumes, but in the episode The Big Day, they just make jokes about how so much has happened in the last 6 months, but that they don't need to get into it because they already know. But even though we, the audience, don't know everything that's happened. So they're having a wedding, and each of the women walks down the aisle wearing a wedding dress. We see Carol, who's visibly pregnant now. We see Erica and Melissa. And Tandy, who's officiating, says, "Pretty ugly spot for a wedding, huh?" And he just laughs at his own joke. And he says, "First of all, I'd like to commend the bridal party for the choice to all wear wedding dresses. Just beautiful. And I mean, we all know who's getting married, so that was not confusing at all." And it turns out that Melissa and Todd are getting married. And Melissa basically has, since this time has passed, she's no longer mentally unstable. And so Tandy says, "Look how far we've come, huh? The last 6 months have been by far the most interesting that we've all shared. A real roller coaster. So many powerful moments. Too many to go into detail, you know. And we were all there anyway, so, you know, what's the friggin' point, yeah? But bottom line, we're stronger than ever." And so backtracking a bit in that season, one of the episodes is titled Got Milk. It's another one that doesn't feature this core group. And in that episode, it's when the virus outbreak first starts. And we meet a woman named Pamela Brinton, played by Kristen Wiig. And she's this affluent woman who isn't affected by the virus. But everyone around her slowly but surely contracts the virus. But at one point when her husband contracts the virus, he just locks himself in a room because he doesn't want his wife to contract it if he can stop it. And she tells him that she's going to make him some soup, and he tells her to leave, and she says, "Fine, but I am making you that soup in my heart." And he says, "And I'm eating it in mine." And so she wears like these trash bags and a facial mask because it's an airborne virus, so a surgical mask. And so then she ends up going to hiding out in a bunker that this woman who's kind of her rival, another rich woman, she ends up living in the bunker with her dog Jeremy. And as she's there, it's another moment where we just see a character alone and how the situation devolves, where she just ends up drinking more and more and just kind of losing it and becoming more and more depressed and lonely and losing hope. But then eventually, when she's getting used to, she discovers a drone, she's getting used to flying it more. And in an earlier episode that season, we see the drone, Gail's the one who sees it first. And so we find out that it is in fact Pamela who's using the drone. But then Melissa ends up shooting the drone. And so Pamela finally ends up leaving the bunker. There's just a moment where she takes down a picture of herself and her husband. She puts back the picture of her rival female friend and her husband, and she says, "Look at you, you're a cat person who eats dog food, and I'm a dog person eating cat food," because she just ends up eating cat food. She says, "Maybe we're more alike than I thought." And so after her dog runs away, then she finally opens the door and she's ready to go out and explore and try to find those people that she saw using the drone. And so in the season 3 finale, Gail successfully helps Erica deliver her baby, and it's a baby girl that she names Dawn because it's the dawn of a new day. By the end of that episode, they have to leave because they see a nuclear power plant melting down, and they decide they can't stay there, otherwise they'll die. And that then, with the smoke rising, that's when Pat discovers them. And so it ends, that season 3 finale ends with Pat bursting in, ready to shoot all of them, and then you just see a gunshot, blood splatter, he falls, and then you just see Pamela, and she says, "Hi, I'm Pamela," and she's got the gun. So she killed him. So then the season 4 premiere, titled Moo Bar, which is an acronym Carol came up with, that stands for Messed Up Beyond All Regular Standards. In that episode, first, it opens with another celebrity cameo on Jack Black getting shot and killed because Pat kills him. Jack Black walks on board and then Pat kills him, and then Pamela shoots him again and kills Pat permanently. In that episode, Pamela tries to befriend the group, but they see that she's going through all their supplies and she's full of herself and not an asset to this group. But she hits it off with Tandy. She thinks Tandy's hilarious, and so she knocks out Tandy, and when they're on this ship now, because they're trying to go to Mexico, and she kicks away the life raft, so they're floating away to an island, and she basically takes Tandy hostage. But then in the end, they reunite again, and they give Pamela a second chance. But when they're on that island, they meet a castaway. His name is Glenn. And so Glenn and Pamela end up hitting it off, and that's how they're only in there for a few episodes, and then they go off together. And so another episode without the group, we meet a man named Carl. And Carl is played by Fred Armisen. And he's an offbeat guy, and at one point the waiter asks if they want to hear the specials, and he just says, "Oh, I'm looking at one," and he's talking to his date. And so we find out that he is a cannibal. He tries to lure people in by saying he wants to paint them, and he kills people and he eats them. And it's really disturbing. And so in another celebrity cameo death, he has someone pull over on the side of the road to help him, and it's Martin Short. And so he just kills him. And so then he ends up in prison, and everyone again slowly contracts the virus. And it ends up being only him left and one of the prison guards. And he assures the prison guard that he's a changed man, he wants to be better, and he ends up killing him because he just wants a chance to be free. And then he's trying to escape the prison, and he's presumably been there for years, because then in the present he's going to kill himself, and then he hears a car. It's Tandy and Todd, who at that point were looking for Jasper. Another arc, actually, that I forgot to mention was in season 3. There's a scary arc where Gail is basically left for dead because she ends up trapped in an elevator. And she says that she was in there for 10 days. And it's scary because it was in the season 3 mid-season finale where you just see the building and just one gunshot, and leaves you to assume that Gail committed suicide, but thankfully she makes it out alive in the end. And so again, now in season 4 with this Carl arc, he tries to befriend the group, but he's tempted. He wants to paint Gail. He's tempted. He wants to kill again and eat people. And so he tries to quelch this desire he digs up a grave and he just eats a finger. That's another disturbing moment in this show. But he ends up dying. So in an earlier episode in season 4, titled La Abuela, in that episode we learn that the house that the group is currently staying in, it was actually a drug cartel, housed by a drug cartel, and the woman explains that there's a bomb planted, and first we're led to believe that the bomb is in a piñata, and when Jasper goes to hit it, that's not where it is. And then Tandy is playing with a Rubik's Cube. So Chekhov's gun, we know that at some point that bomb is going to go off. And it ends up going off when they decide they need to kill Carl. Tandy offers to do it because they draw straws, and Carol draws the shortest straw, but then Tandy takes the responsibility off of his wife, and he's going to kill Carl. And then Carl says, "Well, can I play with this Rubik's Cube?" And he's just playing with it, and then he just ends up blowing up. So that's how he dies. And so, talking about happier stuff now, Todd and Melissa, as I said, they get married, and also Gail and Erica end up getting married. And in another relationship shift, Carol asks Gail to be her mom, and Gail first doesn't want that because Gail says that she lost a son and it wasn't because of the virus. But in the end, Gail agrees to be Carol's mom, which is sweet. So Melissa makes it clear that she doesn't want to have children, but she allows Todd to conceive a child with Erica, and Erica agrees because she wants her daughter Dawn to have a sibling. And Carol ends up giving birth not to one baby but to two. She gives birth to twins, and they're twin girls, and she names one Bezaquel. So the one is named Bezaquel, and the other one is named Mike. She names the baby girl Mike after Tandy's brother Mike, who we assume is gone, but then he ends up coming back actually toward the end of season 4, and he explains that he didn't have the virus. His body was just his immune system was just weakened because he was in outer space for so long. But he ends up coming back and he has a heat map. That's how he was able to find them. And then on that heat map, he discovers this huge blob, and he assumes maybe it could be people. But when they go there, they find nothing there. And Mike basically, when he comes back, he confesses to Tandy that he calls him Phil, but Tandy just is Tandy from this point on. So he confesses to him that he's jealous of him, that he wants a family and everything, and he can't have that because everyone has their own relationships now. And Tandy convinces him that he needs to go off on his own to find whatever it is he's looking for. And Mike is appreciative of that. So in the season 4 finale, and unfortunately the series finale, the group decides that they want to go to Cancun, but then Tandy says that they should just stay in this area where it's a smaller house, but they have all this greenery, all this fresh produce, and that it's better for them. And so, in the episode before that, we see all these people emerge from a bunker. So that's what the blob was, that the heat map showed, that it was a bunch of people living underground that are other survivors of the virus. And so in the final shot of this show, it's the group emerges and they see all these people in masks surrounding them, and Tandy just says, "Oh, farts." So it was left as a cliffhanger that it's this ominous note that the series ends on. And so sadly we don't get to see how the show would have gotten an ending, a proper ending, because each season with this show was on the bubble, meaning it was close to cancellation, but it got 4 seasons. Sadly didn't get what would have most likely have been a final season where they could have had a proper conclusion. But there was an article earlier this year in which Will Forte explained what would have happened in the 5th season, and he says, at a certain point the virus will be dormant, you'll be safe to get back out. Then they see a bunch of stragglers, which is us, as in the group. And he says, and we represent a real threat to them because they thought everyone was dead, so they quarantined them. So then they would have slowly gained their trust, but then they wouldn't have been immune to the virus. So then once they were exposed to the air, they would have all been dying one by one, because these were hundreds of people in this bunker. And so they would have infected them, would have spread, and then it would have been an arc lasting for a few episodes. And then Will Forte said maybe one famous person would have stayed behind. And I don't know how this show, what the final episode of this show would have been. Some people think that maybe they all would have died, which that would have been such a depressing ending, like, say, leaving Tandy as the last man on Earth again. I hope that wouldn't have been the case, because now they had the babies, they had the 3 girls, and Erica was pregnant again because impregnated by Todd, and Carol was pregnant again as well. So it's a shame this show was canceled before it could have had a proper finale, because I ended up really enjoying it. I just enjoyed the season-long arcs and the silly humor and also the dark stuff, the suspenseful stuff. I also ended up really loving Tandy and Carol together. They were just really so cute together. They ended up really actually genuinely loving each other and being really compatible. One of my favorite moments between them, it's like so gross yet adorable for them. Carol blows a kiss to Tandy. I believe this is in the season 3 finale. Carol blows a kiss to Tandy. Candy takes the kiss, the air kiss. He eats it. He pretends to poop it out. He blows it back over to her, and she takes it and eats it. So gross and odd, but so them. They were so cute. So I like this show. I miss it. It's sad it's gone. I had hopes at one point that maybe Hulu would have picked it up, but obviously that didn't happen. But what are you going to do? That's TV. At least we got a glimpse at what would have happened. And it still had a decent run. 4 seasons, 67 episodes. And it was a good show. Clever concept. And fun to watch. Even with all the darker stuff and the scary stuff that happened. It was a good show. And with that, that's going to conclude this episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, I didn't know she could fly. I think it's 'cause she's a witch. I'll be discussing the Rugrats movie. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.